So as Rebecca mentioned, I'm Trevor Paglen, and I'm an artist, and I do a lot of different kinds of work. Some people describe the kind of work that I do as having like a research-based practice. And I think that just means like I have a studio, I go and I work in the studio and stuff like that, but I'm not somebody who goes into the studio every morning and then like comes out at the end of the day with something that I made, right? I spend a lot of time out in the world doing empirical work, looking at things, and really trying to understand how to see. And I feel like that's really a big part of what I'm trying to do with a lot of the work that I do, is trying to understand how to learn how to see the historical moment that we're living in. And that's really what I want out of art. And sometimes that can be a pretty big job. I've done a lot of different kinds of projects. Rebecca mentioned some of them about building satellites and doing all kinds of weird things. But I've done a number of projects around secrecy and looking at the secret parts of the state, trying to understand what are all of the institutions that are around us all of the time that strongly sculpt the present and strongly sculpt what the future will probably hold. And so those are the kind of projects that I want to talk about today, the kind of projects having to do with secrecy. And I specifically want to talk today about how to see secrecy. What does secrecy look like? This is an excerpt from a project called Code Names, where I've just collected thousands and thousands of code names of classified programs that have been active over the last decade or so. People tend to think about secrecy as being a question about what you get to know versus what you don't get to know. And the stuff that you get to know is not secret, and what you don't get to know is secret. I do not think about secrecy this way at all, and I'm talking about state secrecy. I think about secrecy instead of being less about what you get to know versus what you don't get to know, and being more about a kind of way of doing things, a kind of way of organizing activities. And it's a way of organizing activities that has political aspects to it, has economic aspects to it, has legal aspects to it, cultural aspects, and so on. This is an installation of that Codenames exhibition at the Van Abbe Museum. It's up right now in the Netherlands. Now, if secrecy is a way of doing things, it's a way of doing things whose goal is invisibility, silence, obscurity. And in this first instance, secrecy is therefore what we might call a kind of abstract space. And it's an abstract space because it actually doesn't exist, right? It's a logic, it's a set of conventions, it doesn't exist. And this logic only exists insofar as it is applied to things in the world. Secrecy only exists insofar as it congeals into the surface of the earth. The earth and everything in it is made out of stuff, and therefore secrecy, in a very fundamental sense, is also made out of stuff. And that stuff can be any number of things. It can be infrastructures like the National Security Agency here, or the CIA. It can be economic institutions, such as the so-called black budget, the secret part of the federal budget that's also hidden from most of Congress. It can be social engineering institutions, such as the security classification system. It can be legal institutions.
What about your personal safety with all this stuff? And I compared you to Ed Snowden, who's not having a good day vis-a-vis the US government. But have you had intimations of, I'm sure you're being watched, but do you worry about it? Or do you just feel like if you can't be invisible, you might as well be so visible that what happens to you
Well, I get asked that question a lot, and one of the things I say is like, well, the whole point of the NSA stuff is that we're all being surveilled, right? You know, there's nothing special about being surveilled at this point. Having said that, I don't break the law in anything that I do. That's not interesting to me. I'm very clear about what I kind of spend a lot of time figuring out where are the lines here, and figuring out what I'm basically not to cross them. So I'm working within, the legal framework here. And a lot of this work is possible because the US is an extraordinarily contradictory place, as we know, where on one hand, there's literally, a huge sector of the state that work in secret, that have nothing to do with democracy, in terms of how they operate. And that secret state really has a global footprint across the world. At the same time, the United States is the most open society in the world, at the same time as having this huge secret part of the state. So, for example, there's no statutory basis for secrecy in the United States. It's all done by executive order. So, for example, if you're a journalist and you find out some secret stuff, you can, this is, again, theoretically, you can publish it all that you want because you're not subject to these executive orders if you're not working for the executive branch. Now, obviously, that is a little bit,
That hasn't worworked out so well for some journalists, yeah.
Yeah, but it's worked out a lot better than it has for journalists trying to do this stuff in Israel or the UK or, these kind of places. And so, but the other thing that I think that question speaks to is, and one thing that makes me uncomfortable about it is that underlying the question is a fear of the state. And that is something that a lot of us have. Is that